Welcome, everyone, to Liberty Classroom's course, The History of Economic Thought 1, Classical Economics and the Marginal Revolution. I am your instructor, Robert Murphy. We're now on Lecture 12, Frederick Bastiat, a wonderful human being as far as human beings go. Bastiat, 1801 to 1850. So a life tragically cut short, but wow, did he produce a lot during those short years. Okay, so he was born in the port town in the south of France. He was orphaned at 9. I believe his mom died when he was maybe 7, and then his dad died when he was 9. So at that point, he was raised by his grandfather and aunt. I think they came from different sides of the family. And then at 24, the grandfather even dies. And at this point, Bastiat inherits the family estate in Mugron. Apologize to my French listeners if I'm mispronouncing the name of that location. So then it's not until 1844 that he submits his first major essay. So he sends it in to the Journal of Economists, and they're shocked. Right? So David Hart is the Liberty Fund scholar in charge of the Bastiat collection, and he came and gave a talk here at Texas Tech, the Free Market Institute, recently. It was fascinating. I mean, Bastiat is this amazing guy, like more than just his writings, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But and the way Hart explains it is that these, the people in Paris, they thought they were the center of the universe, at least as far as the French tradition, the laissez-faire tradition of economic thought. And here they get this essay from this guy who had read everything. He obviously had read Smith and Say and Ricardo and so on, and they were just, who is this guy? Because how do we not know about him? How could he be this well-read and knowledgeable and just a brilliant writer if he hasn't been corresponding with us? Because he did all this without us. How's that possible? And so then they had him come into town, and they were kind of shocked by him because he was like a country bumpkin as far as they were concerned, and yet he was this brilliant economist. So besides his literary output, well, or I should say his formal economic output, the stuff that we might be familiar with today, Hart tells the story that Bastiat was just a real entertaining guy, that he was the life of the party, and he doing things like he could hold court, getting up and entertaining people by playing a musical instrument, I forget which one, and then doing impressions of the politicians and things. So I mean, the point was he was a real entertaining character. And then also thinking very strategically in terms of how do we bring liberty to France, forming friendships with people abroad like Richard Cobden and so forth, the famous English free trader, and working to overturn the Corn Laws and to get a free trade pact between England and France. So just all kinds of things like that. And then he even went into politics too, and was, as Rothbard describes it, instrumental with behind the scenes kind of maneuvering to keep taxes low and to cut government spending and so on. So really interesting guy all around. I wish I had time to go into it, but if you get your hands on any of David Hart's essays on just the personal adventures of Bastiat, you'll be pleasantly surprised. Sort of like a French Thomas Paine, if you're familiar with Paine's life. Okay, so some of his major works: Economic Sophisms, came out in 1845, The Law, 1850, and Economic Harmonies, also 1850. Okay, let me spend a minute before I dive into his work to address this concern that some people, like, for example, Keynesians today, like Paul Krugman and so forth, they don't think much of Bastiat. All right, and they roll their eyes when free market economists today bring up the broken window fallacy, for example. And oh my goodness, here we go. They're trotting out this essay from some guy in the 1800s who really wasn't even that good of a theorist, right? And so that's the smear, or maybe smear is a hard word. That's the assessment of Bastiat that you will get from a lot of economists in the 20th century. And I think partly it's a reaction because the free market economists of the 20th century, a lot of them just adore Bastiat, And so, again, it's kind of like, I think I made the analogy before that some people say, oh, yeah, the Beatles are terrible. Well, come on, you probably don't think that. It's just so many people are saying the Beatles are the best ever that you kind of react. So I think it's the same thing here. But the specific complaint is, or critique, is that Bastiat didn't really advance economic theory. Yeah, he was a witty writer and he had a good turn of phrase and he could come up with good analogies and things. But come on, if you're doing a history of economic thought, he's a footnote. That would be sort of a harsh assessment you might make. So let me read what Rothbard had to say about that kind of mentality. So first, Rothbard, where I'm reading from, Rothbard had first spent some time explaining the influence not just of Bastiat, but of the French laissez-faire school. So again, if you remember from last lecture, I was explaining that it's not enough just to talk about classical economic thought, that there were different currents, and you can see a definite distinction between the thought as it went from Cantillon to Turgot and J.B. Say and Bastiat on the one hand versus the British tradition, Hume, Smith, Ricardo, and then John Stuart Mill. So you can see a definite distinction, even though those people all corresponded with each other, read each other, and so on. And so here now Rothbard is talking about the lasting impact of the French school. So dominant was the laissez-faire school in France during the 19th century that its teachings permeated the popular culture. Popular writers, journalists, and novelists expounded on the harmony of interests and on the mutual benefit and the general prosperity brought about by the free market. Thus, no more lucid and inspiring an economic primer and paean to the workings of the free market has ever been written than the lectures to French workers formed into the Handbook of Social Economy, or the Workers' ABC, written by the popular novelist Edmond About. I don't know how to pronounce his French name. Indeed, the very lucidity and popularity of the French writers was turned against them by the British classical economists. Let me read that again. So this is Rothbard. Indeed, the very lucidity and popularity of the French writers was turned against them by the British classical economists, generally dense and obscure writers, who could turn their very elegance of style against the French and denounce them for superficiality of thought and scholarship. This tradition has been redoubled by modern historians, whose intense hostility to the French writers' political conclusions reinforces their brusque dismissal. In particular, modern historians unfairly dismiss the French writers as mere popularizers, lacking theoretical depth. All right, so again, Rothbard is just saying that it's ironic that the British people at the time even could sort of poo-poo or downplay the importance, the theoretical insights and innovations of their French peers by saying, oh yeah, they're just popularizers. And Rothbard's saying, yeah, he thinks partly what's driving that is because the British writers, their prose was so turgid and boring, whereas the French writers, it just sparkled. And so if you were a boring writer and you saw somebody who was really an excellent writer and thousands of people were reading your pamphlets or whatever, and you were actually changing public opinion, then you can imagine if you're some boring theoretician that nobody can parse except other experts, you would say, oh yeah, well they must just be dumbing it down for the masses. There's probably no there because otherwise why would they be so popular? So anyway, you see that in all walks of life. Okay, so let's talk about the law. Here I am reading from the, I think this is the introduction by Walter Williams to one of the modern reprints of this. I must have been 40 years old before reading Bastiat's classic, The Law. After reading the book, I was convinced that a liberal arts education without an encounter with Bastiat is incomplete. Reading Bastiat made me keenly aware of all the time wasted, along with the frustrations of going down one blind alley after another, organizing my philosophy of life. Okay, so that was Walter Williams, the famous modern-day free market economist. So here he's explaining just how influential Bastiat's book was to him. Also, I know, so Gary Wolfram, great guy at Hillsdale College, was one of my professors and then was my boss, I guess, when I taught at Hillsdale. His political economy, his intro to political economy, wonderful class. And he just always, year after year, everybody reads The Law cover to cover, I'm pretty sure. And he just keeps teaching it because he's saying, I haven't found a better thing. If you want to teach classical liberalism, free market economic way of thinking to people, this is what you use. I participated in a training session, I don't know what you call it, seminar, recently with some staffers in the Texas legislature that a free market institution was putting on. And so I was meeting with a bunch of, they're young people primarily, and I was supposed to teach them, give them some readings and then talk just about classical liberalism or political liberty in this tradition. And I had one of the readings, large excerpts from the law. Because again, in terms of just getting across classical liberalism, the view of the individual and his relationship to the government and so on, what's the proper role of the state, things like that, you don't find a better exposition than Bastiat's, which comes from the middle of the 19th century. Okay, so let me just, and of course for the readings associated with this lecture, I'm giving you large excerpts from all of his works so you can see this stuff in context and just, soak in the eloquence of it. But here, let me just do some of the greatest hits. So the law perverted. So this is how he starts out the law. He says, the law perverted, and the police powers of the state perverted along with it. The law, I say, not only turned from its proper purpose, but made to follow an entirely contrary purpose. The law become the weapon of every kind of greed. Instead of checking crime, the law itself guilty of the evils it is supposed to punish. And by the way, there's exclamation points in all this. It's not just that I'm getting into it. This is how Bastiat opens up. He's just using exclamation point after exclamation point. If this is true, it is a serious fact, and moral duty requires me to call the attention of my fellow citizens to it. All right, so what he's developing here is saying, look at it, when you understand what the law is supposed to do, notice it's not merely that the people running the government right now and who have control of the police power and the military and so forth, it's not merely that they're failing to enforce the proper role of government and, punishing thieves and things like that. He's saying they are the biggest thieves. So that's what he's saying, the law perverted. So he's not saying the law asleep at the wheel. He's saying the law perverted. Okay, so what is law? Well, Bastiat's glad you asked. What then is law? It is the collective organization of the individual right to lawful defense. It follows that a group of men have the right to organize and support a common force to protect these rights constantly. Thus, the principle of collective right, its reason for existing, its lawfulness, is based on individual right, and the common force that protects this collective right cannot logically have any other purpose or any other mission than that for which it acts as a substitute. All right, so this is huge in terms of, I guess you'd call it libertarian theory, or political theory even. So, and by the way, let me just mention before I forget, in case you're driving around just hearing this lecture from me in terms of the audio, there's ellipses in some of these quotes that I'm reading, all right? So don't memorize these as verbatim quotes from Bastiat, that I'm leaving out stuff to make the quotes manageable. So what is he getting at here? He is saying that the law is really just the collective organization, the pooling together of what every individual has the right to do, of lawful defense. Okay, so he's saying, and earlier he had said that using your insight into reason and the natural order of things, and you realize that God has given us property and our lives and so forth, and we have the right to defend ourselves with force if need be. So you can't go and violate somebody else's rights, of course, using violence. But if somebody's trying to hurt you or take your stuff, and it really is your stuff, you have the right to use weaponry or force to defend your person or your property. And he's grounding that not because some king said so. He's saying that's ultimately from God. And then, okay, so if you as an individual have the right to do that, well, you have the right to delegate that right or that ability to somebody else who can execute it more efficiently or more safely or more effectively. Right? So you could say, yeah, if some bully comes along or some gang comes along and they're going to steal my horse, I have the right to defend myself and to use force to stop them, but maybe I can't. And so, but I can, hire 20 other young strapping lads to come along and protect my horse. And they're not doing it, even though it's not their horse, they're not doing anything wrong because all they're doing is helping me to exercise my right of defensive property. Right? So they're not aggressors, they're not lawbreakers. They're actually helping to uphold the law. And so then ultimately you can see where this is going. This is what the police power is supposed to do, is just to be an organized way that society, the weak individuals of society can defend themselves collectively against criminals, people who are, thieves or murderers, what have you. And so, and this is the famous thing that, you see to this very day in terms of libertarian analysis of property rights and delegation of powers and the role of the state and so on, is Bastiat says, once you understand that what the government can do, by the way, for the purposes of this lecture, I'm going to be using the terms government and police power in this state kind of interchangeably. I just want to note before I forget that that in other contexts, that's not a good thing to do. All right, like Albert J. Nock has a whole thing about the state and government are distinct, and you don't want to conflate the two. But for the purposes of this lecture, I'm not going to be able to help it. I'm going to use those terms interchangeably. Okay, back to Bastiat. He's saying that once you understand what the proper role of government is and the police power, then you see that it can't possibly be that the government has the right to do anything that you as an individual wouldn't have the right to do. Okay, so now here's me talking, not Bastiat. You see this a lot in modern times, and that's why Walter Williams is so indebted to Bastiat for organizing his philosophy or his worldview, because Williams is great at making points like this, asking, well, wait a minute, I don't have the right to go up to somebody and say you can't smoke because it's bad for you, right? There's nobody would dream that I personally, Walter Williams, have the right to do that. So then how in the world can it be that if I and 50% of my neighbors all vote in an election and we elect a politician and then he passes the law, and, with the other politicians, to outlaw smoking or to put regulations on smoking? How can that be? How can we give the government the right, the power to do something that we collectively, we individually don't have the right to do? So if we don't have the right to do it as individuals, how can we pool together and give the government the right to do that? Right? That's the idea. And so you see this very eloquently way back in Bastiat. Okay, legal plunder. So here's Bastiat. Law cannot operate without the sanction and support of a dominating force. This force must be entrusted to those who make the laws. Then a little bit later, this fact, combined with the fatal tendency that exists in the heart of man to satisfy his wants with the least possible effort, explains the almost universal perversion of the law. All right, so he's explaining he had earlier talked about there's two ways of getting what you want. You can work and produce and exchange, or you can just plunder. And he's saying, without moral considerations and so on, obviously plunder is easier, at least if you're strong and the victims don't have the means of defending themselves. Why would you waste your time and effort laboring and toiling and so forth, producing things, when you can just steal? And so he's saying that what ends up happening is, just because the nature of the government, this is standard stuff, but you give the police, the government, the power of the police force so that they can stop normal criminals, but now think of things from the perspective of the lawmakers. And he's not being a positivist here. He means like the legislators, all right? So when he says they make the laws, he doesn't mean that something is lawful merely because Parliament says so. He's just using it in the everyday sense of the things that the police power enforces. So if the people in charge now have a really strong state and police force, well, why wouldn't they engage in plunder? If we've just analyzed history and the nature of man and so forth and the tendencies to corrupt him, you can see the danger of that system. And so he's saying this is why, in practice, we end up with what he calls legalized plunder, which is just a wonderful, or just legal plunder perhaps, which is just a great term to signify what it is that the state does. By the way, I don't think I have it in the PowerPoints here, but let me just say it. a wonderful Bastiat quote. I mean, we've got him hanging here in the Free Market Institute in our pantheon of heroes. He's also got the great phrase saying, "The state is the great fiction by which everyone tries to live at the expense of everyone else." All right, so boom, there you go. Analysis from Bastiat. Let's now, in the last 10 minutes or so of this lecture, turn to more strictly economic writings. And so, by the way, you can see how, if you were not a diehard laissez-faire person in terms of your policy views and you're a professional economist, you would think Bastiat is wishy-washy and a polemicist and an ideologue. And, oh, yeah, I can see why those free market guys like Murray Rothbard would like him, because he's a cheerleader for their extreme dogmatism. But, we serious economists who look at the issues, case by case and are very sophisticated. You get the point why they would look down upon Bastiat as merely a rabble-rouser and just, he was good at writing fiery essays, but come on, he wasn't a serious scholar. Again, that's the popular among the elites put down of Bastiat. Okay, but now let's turn to his more strictly economic writings. So he's got this great notion of a harmony of interests. So in complete contrast to the socialists, Bastiat taught that there was a harmony of interest between all of the classes of people, and I put in parentheses the productive classes, right? So there's not necessarily a harmony of interest between the rulers, the political class, and everybody else. But what he means is the socialists were going around telling workers, the capitalists are your enemy, right? Or the managers are your enemy. You workers need to stick together. And Bastiat was telling them, no, you're all in this together, that the workers, you want the capitalists to earn high profits. And, the capitalists, you want the ability to pay high wages to workers because that means they're productive. And this is a win-win sort of thing. And certainly in terms of international trade, you can see how the free trade, laissez-faire French economists were preaching to the world, hey, let's all get along, right? We don't need to have hostility towards each other. It's not a contest to see who can export more to the other person. We all benefit from unfettered free trade. It's not a contest to see who can accumulate the most gold and silver, the way the mercantilist mindset makes it a zero-sum game. And, oh no, we either have a favorable or unfavorable trade balance with our neighbor over there. And so if we're going to have a favorable trade balance, they necessarily must have an unfavorable one. So it's just a matter of who's more powerful in terms of who's going to win in this struggle to have more exports. And the free trade approach says, no, that's the wrong way to look at it. We mutually benefit from enhanced trade with each other. And if we're importing stuff from them, good. That means our people are getting stuff more cheaply than we could produce it domestically. That's great. That's not hurting us at all. They're sending us valuable products. Why would we be mad that they're sending us stuff? That doesn't make any sense. Okay. What about exchange and utility? So I have here, in contrast to the British classicals who focused on production and accumulation of physical wealth, the French economists, including Bastiat, of course, had more emphasis on the exchange of goods and the subjective utility that people got from consumption. Okay, so here, it's not a all or nothing kind of thing. You can go and read in The Wealth of Nations and David Hume and Ricardo's work and John Stuart Mill. Obviously, you can see them groping around the idea of subjective utility, and they understood, that was part of the problem with the water diamond paradox, if you remember, that Adam Smith knew full well that ultimately the reason people care about physical goods is that they give us happiness in some sense, or they're useful to us. And so that's why it was kind of odd that, you would think water would have a higher market value than diamonds, right? Because water is more useful to us. Right, so clearly it wasn't like the British classical economists had no idea that subjective happiness in your mind had something to do with the economy. Of course they knew that. But the point is, when you read their stuff and the models they ended up using and the way they constructed their analysis and how was it that they would talk about the determination of prices, exchange ratios and so on, you definitely could see a tendency among the British writers to think in terms of physical things and focus on production and the net accumulation of more tangible wealth. Whereas in contrast, among the French writers, you definitely had more of an emphasis not so much on the actual production of goods, but more on, okay, given that we've got these goods that exist and they're in different hands right now, what rules or principles govern how those things are exchanged and at what ratios do they exchange? And then ultimately, rather than focusing on a nation being richer because it's accumulating more and more physical, tangible wealth, from which you might take away from the wealth of nations. Because remember, the wealth of nations was largely about, yes, importing stuff abroad more cheaply than you can produce it at home, but really was net savings and investment, which is fine, right? That's great. If I had to choose between today's Keynesians and Adam Smith and his focus on net investment and accumulation, well, you think the choice is obvious. But my point is, strictly speaking, when you talk about what makes our nation better off economically in the modern sense, we focus more on, well, it's the subjective standard of living, and that's not something you can go measure by, how many forklifts there are or how many factories. It's ultimately the point of production is to make things that people get utility from. So ultimately, if you were just producing for its own sake, that would be silly, right? The end of production is consumption. Now, by me saying that doesn't mean you should be a hedonist, but the point still is that, you talk about the value of hard work and thrift and industry and so forth and doing a good job. Well, if what you were doing was ultimately not helping anybody, then that would be a waste of time. That would be stupid. You would be working merely for its own sake. Instead of doing that, you should work to produce things that give utility. And again, it doesn't mean you're producing plasma screen TVs. Maybe the utility is you're making more Bibles and works of art or something for people to go study and derive inspiration from. Okay. Bastiat's got this great essay of what is seen and what is unseen. And so in this, he isolated the mark of a good economist as someone who contrasts the obvious impacts of a government policy, the thing that the dull person notices, contrast that with the hidden long-run effects. So that you get the point that the layperson and the politician focuses on what is seen, whereas the good analyst and then the other people who are clever and wise will also take into account what is unseen. Right? So this idea of opportunity cost in particular. So if you've read Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson, that's what the lesson is. And then he just says the lesson explained or illustrated. I forget which word he uses. But Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson, the one lesson is the good economist traces out all of the effects, both hidden and long run, from a certain policy change, whereas the dull person or the bad economist just looks at the immediate impact, what's right in front of your face. So if you love Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson, I don't know if this is good or bad to tell you, that's not really original. He got that all from Bastiat. And Hazlitt would be the first to admit that, by the way. I mean, he credits Bastiat. Okay, the broken window. So here's a great example. Probably the most famous chapter from Hazlitt's book is on the broken window, but he took that from Bastiat. And so the story, the basic, let me do it in terms of Rothbard. I like the way Rothbard analyzes it. I had been thinking along these lines too, so when I see Rothbard doing it this way, it makes me think, okay, good, I was on the right track. So here's a way to think about it. The basic story is there's some ruffian, some hooligan teenagers, they're screwing around, or maybe it's one guy, depends on the story, the details differ, and he throws a rock through a nice big window at some storefront, shatters it. And so a crowd gathers lamenting this. And so initially, what do people say is, oh my gosh, you just broke this guy's window. What'd you do that for? This is bad. So the initial reaction is a kid breaking property is a bad thing. It makes the community poorer. But then, the way Bastiat tells it, he said, some sophisticated people will pontificate and say, well, wait a minute, let's not rush to judgment here. Actually, now the storekeeper is going to have to spend money repairing that window, right? Because he's not going to just sit there with a broken window in his shop. He's going to have to fix that. And so that's going to provide employment to the glazier and the people who come and make windows. And now, it doesn't stop there. They're going to have more money in their pockets, and so they're going to go out and maybe they're going to buy some pastries. So now the baker's going to benefit too. So you see there's going to be ripples of economic activity because of what this kid did. So far from making our community poor, he's actually stimulating spending and employment. So you can see why Rothbard calls that person the proto-Keynesian. So at this point, it looks like the layperson is wrong because the layperson was too stupid to look beyond the obvious immediate impact of the broken window, and it takes this sophisticated proto-Keynesian analyst to say, oh, wait a minute, let's look at what's unseen. But then Rothbard's saying there's a third level of analysis, which is represented by Bastiat, who says, what are you talking about? The layperson's instincts are correct. Of course this makes the community poorer. Because, look, if that kid hadn't broken the window, then what would the shopkeeper have done with the money? You know, the money that now he's going to have to spend on the window. He could have had his store refurbished. Maybe he could have bought a new oven or something, or a new shelf. It depends what kind of store it is. Or if he just wanted to spend on consumption, maybe he'd go and buy a new coat for his wife. And so whatever he ends up doing, he's still going to generate employment. And they might be in different lines, or different types of workers in the community are going to benefit from the one scenario versus the other. But it's not that the city as a whole and the economy of the city as a whole is going to be stimulated because of the broken window. You're still going to, you still, with that guy spending his money, is going to cause employment to go up or cause wages to flow and spending to flow in one line versus another. The difference is, in this alternate scenario, we have the window plus whatever these other things are. Like we have the window plus the fur coat that he gets for his wife, or the window plus the new shelf in the store. Whereas when the kid breaks the window, we still have the same total effect on employment and wages and so on, but all it's doing is replenishing the window that we already had before. All right, so we don't, on net, we're poor by, drumroll please, one store window. If the kid breaks the window, we're starting from that deficit, and so we have to just to get back to where we were to replace that store window. So you can see that the more sophisticated analysis shows the layperson's right. Give me a break. You don't get rich by destroying stuff. And as primitive or as obvious as that back and forth is, it's with us to this day. That modern Keynesian economists still do say things like, if there's an earthquake or a terrible attack or whatever, people were saying this after 9/11, that, well, the silver lining in this tragedy is at least this is going to stimulate employment. Reconstruction efforts are going to boost aggregate demand and blah, 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 blah. So to be clear, usually they don't come out and say, I'm glad this happened. All right, so it's not that like after 9/11, Paul Krugman came out and said, I'm glad this happened. He didn't say that, but he was saying, yeah, it's a tragedy, but you know what? The silver lining is at least this is going to goad the government into spending money and blah, 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 blah. So it's not a straw man. And as Rothbard's pointing out, there's like three layers of analysis. First is just what the untrained economist sees, the average person, and they fortunately have common sense and know when somebody breaks property that makes the community poorer, duh. And then it takes just a little bit more sophistication to try to flip that and reach the exact opposite conclusion. And so then you have to be the correct level of sophistication to come along and say, no, actually, the layperson's right, and it's you, sort of simpleton economists, who are wrong. You looked beyond step one, but you should have kept going. Okay, and the last thing we'll talk about is the petition of the candle makers. I argue that this is the most famous essay in the history of economics. So what it is Bastiat, it's a satirical essay. All right, so he had absorbed, of course, the logic of free trade from Smith and Say and Ricardo and so on. So he knew the case for free trade, and he was trying to come up with a way to really just hammer it home so everybody would just see, oh my goodness, protectionism is crazy. So the approach he took is he pretended, it was a satirical essay, he pretended to be writing on behalf of the candle makers who were writing to the legislature, and what they wanted was a law that would say during daylight hours, the owners of buildings have to, shut the windows up so that sunlight can't come in. And so what would be the effect of that? Well, if people can't enjoy the sunlight coming in during the day, they need illumination, they're going to have to buy more candles. And so and he just walks through and says that would stimulate sales for the candle makers. And they walk through and list all the benefits. And so, see, we'll have to hire more workers. Now the workers will have more wages, and so they'll go out and spend it at the shops and whatever, so the merchants around town will be happy. And so he's trying to show, look at the economic benefits that are just going to spill over from sector to sector in France if you guys have the wisdom of blocking out the sun, because, face it, how can we compete with the sunlight? You know, it's not fair. All of this illumination is coming in for free. We can't possibly compete with that because it takes real resources on our end to make candles and produce artificially illumination, which even to the best of our abilities is not comparable to the sun. So it's not merely that the sun is free, but its product is better than what we can do. So how can we possibly compete? Clearly, we need to keep out that unfair competition. All right, so you see the logic. You can see how that's analogous. And Bastiat says, you know, you may think that this is wrong or whatever, but just notice. And so then he flips it to saying, you already do this with regard to cheap imports from other countries. So we're just asking you to be consistent. If you're keeping out cheap, whatever, corn or something from abroad on the grounds that this stimulates domestic industry and provides higher employment and wages and so on, and keeps a favorable balance of trade or whatever terminology they want to use, he's saying all those arguments apply all the more so to the sun. Because again, it's not merely that the sun is charging a lower price, the sun is giving us light for free. How can we possibly compete with that? And so it just drives home. So it's worthwhile to think through, not just to say, oh yeah, that's silly, those idiots, and then move on. I'm challenging you to say, why is it wrong? Right? It's worth walking through step by step and convincing yourself. Don't just dismiss it because it's absurd, and it is absurd, but ask yourself, why is it absurd? Because when you walk through that, then you really understand why protectionism is also absurd, just not as patently ridiculous as trying to block out the sun. So why is it absurd? Because if we allow the sunlight in during the daytime, yeah, we don't make as many candles. And that's good. That means it frees up those resources, right? The wax or whatever else it would go in the wicks and so forth that would go in the candle, those can get channeled elsewhere. And the workers who would be needed to make those extra candles now are freed up and they can go do other things. So once the economy re-equilibrates to the new situation, we benefit from getting all this sunlight coming in for free. And so the French workers and resources can be deployed to other outlets so that not only do you have illumination during the day, but you have whatever else they can make on top of that. So your standard of living is higher. You get the light for free, and then you get whatever else the workers make who otherwise would have been diverted, shunted into making more candles if you foolishly kept that free sunlight out. Okay, so that is why you don't make your country richer by blocking the sun. That would be stupid. Now, once you see that, you can see, all right, if all of a sudden there's an innovation abroad and, you know, maybe there's advances in international shipping, and now all of a sudden some country is sending us corn at a much lower price than our domestic farmers can possibly compete with. They can't grow corn and sell it when these people are flooding our market with this ridiculously cheap corn. So should we keep it out to maintain employment in our agricultural sector? Well, no, because let that cheap corn come in. That will allow our workers and resources to get redeployed to make other stuff. So now our people not only have food, but they also have whatever other things get produced. Now, what we've really just demonstrated there is that the country as a whole is made better off if you let in either free sunlight or cheap food. We haven't shown that each individual person's better off. Actually, some people suffer relative to a situation where the government keeps out either the free sunlight or the cheap corn. So that's why, by the way, well, let me put it this way. If you think that's an important objection, that, well, wait a minute, you know, if we put up tariff barriers, that really will help some people, namely, you know, the agricultural sector, if we're talking about foreign imports of corn. And those workers really might have a higher standard of living. Yeah, food's going to be more expensive, but their paychecks are going to be really high because they work in food production. And so all things considered, that small group of our society of workers who are specifically devoted to corn production, they may be genuinely better off if we have a high tariff on foreign food imports coming in. But if you think that's a good argument, Bastiat's there to tell you, okay, the same thing is true for keeping out the sunlight. The candle makers really will be better off if we block the sunlight during daylight hours. They're going to make a lot more money. And so, yeah, inside their house is going to be dimly lit during the daytime because they just have to go by with candlelight, but they're going to be, 5 times as wealthy in money terms or something. So that's why they're writing the essay or the petition. That's why they want this legislation, because they know it's going to help them. But the point is, it impoverishes the vast majority of their fellow Frenchmen. Okay, we will stop there, and I will see you guys next time.